The intake proctor at Varric Thun Station 3 looked at my enrollment file for a long time. Not the way someone reads a document they haven't seen before. The way someone reads a document they wish they hadn't been handed. Server track candidate, she said finally. Her name was Proctor Vethsel, and she was Sorvan, pale gray skin the texture of fired clay, 4 ocular ridges, stacked above a small lipless mouth, fingers that moved like she was perpetually sorting through something I couldn't see. Visional enrollment, non-combat, non-bonded, no institutional affiliation. He set the file down. The observer track does not run a trial rotation. The observer track is classroom attendance, monitored assessment, and 18 months of supervised cognitive profiling. You understand that, yes? I do, I said. Then I am reading your file correctly. She picked it up again. You have requested trial candidacy. Varric Thun trial architecture, 90 hours sealed sequence. She looked at me over the top of the document. As an observer track enrollee. That's right. The silence that followed was not unfriendly. It was the silence of someone waiting for me to realize I had made an error. I didn't say anything. The trial architecture, she said slowly, is reserved for third-tier cadets who have completed 2 full rotations of preconditioning intake. It involves, among other things, extended atmospheric variance, induced perceptual disruption, calibrated sleep architecture suppression, and graduated neurological load protocols specific to each candidate's physiological and cognitive profile. She paused. You have been on this station for 11 days. 13, I said. She checked the file. 13 days. And you have no preconditioning rotation on record. None. 0 hours logged. That's also correct. She studied me for a moment. The 4th ocular ridge, the one above all the others, flicked independently in a way that I'd come to understand, indicated something between consternation and recalibrated caution. She'd done it twice already in this conversation. May I ask, she said, qualifies you to believe you are prepared for the trial architecture? I thought about it. About 400 days in the Ecuadorian Interior Survey Corridor, 8 months in the Namib Grid, 2 winters on the Lofoten Deep Mapping Rotation, 11 weeks above the Arctic Circle with a 2-person team, no resupply, and a comms array that gave out in week 3. I paused. On Earth. Before I came here. She looked at me. The Namib Grid includes a region where the electromagnetic interference from a particular geological formation suppresses standard perception aids, I said. You work in reduced visibility blackouts that last anywhere from 4 hours to 11. The survey grid doesn't stop for them. You learn to navigate by what you can confirm, rather than by what you feel. You stop assigning meaning to ambient phenomena you can't verify. You catalog, you log, you keep moving. I met her eyes. Told that's approximately what the trial architecture is designed to prevent you from doing. Veth Essel looked at my file again. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at my file one more time, as though it might have changed in the interval. The 4th ridge flicked. I will need, she said, to escalate this to the director of trial candidacy. I understand. She will almost certainly deny the request. I understand that too. She did not deny it. I found this out 2 days later, standing in a different room, in front of a different proctor and 2 very quiet administrative aides, being told that my candidacy had been granted on a provisional basis, and that this decision had required the personal authorization of Director Voth, Keln herself. This information was delivered in the tone people use when they want you to understand that you have generated considerable work for multiple individuals of elevated status, and that this is, in some meaningful form, your fault. I thanked them. Of the aides made a sound I couldn't classify. The trial cohort for rotation 712 consisted of 14 candidates. I was the 15th, added to the roster 3 days before the sealed sequence began, which meant I was technically a late add, and sat on the administrative record as a provisional inclusion. The other 14 were third-tier cadets from across 6 species. All of them passed their preconditioning rotations. All of them profiled and logged in the architecture's calibration system. I had submitted to the standard intake profiling, physiological sensors, cognitive baseline, neurological mapping. And the architecture had processed me for 40 minutes before issuing a report that apparently required 3 separate sections of notation and 2 flagged classification queries. I did not get to read the report. Proctor Vethsel, whom I encountered in the corridor 2 days before the trial, told me that the architecture had labeled my neurological response profile as anomalous baseline, insufficient historical comparison data, trial parameters applied at conservative tier. She said this the way people say things they hope will discourage you. I thanked her. The sealed sequence began at Eero 600 on the first day of the 7-station month, in a facility on Varric Thun's eastern wing that I had only seen from outside. It was larger than it looked from the outside, which I expected, quieter than any facility that size had any right to be, which I also expected. The architecture's designers had spent a great deal of effort on the quality of that silence. It was not the absence of sound. It was a silence with texture. A silence that did work, that occupied space in the room, and pressed lightly against the inside of your ears the way deep water presses. I noticed it the moment the intake gate sealed behind us. The 14 other candidates noticed it too, in different ways. 3 of them stopped moving briefly. 2 adjusted their sensory calibration rigs, the small devices many species use to help their nervous systems contextualize unfamiliar environments. One of them, a Vether cadet named Soren Kale, whose intake profile I'd seen posted at the orientation board, tilted his elongated skull fractionally toward the left wall and held very still, the way prey animals hold still when something moves in the peripheral dark. I looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was smooth, white cream, slightly luminescent, and absolutely unremarkable. I filed this. Whatever the architecture was going to do, it had not started with the ceiling. To know. We were directed to our bunks, 15 individual sleep alcoves in a tiered ring around a central common area, and issued the trial's basic kit, a data log for manual recording, no connected system, no external signal, no AI assistance of any kind. A standard issue caloric supplement block rated for 4 days of basic function, though the trial ran 90 hours, which was slightly more than 4 days. And I noted the arithmetic discrepancy without concern, because I had learned in the survey work that caloric rating on supplement blocks was calculated for active physical exertion, and a 90-hour cognitive trial without heavy physical demands make the block last considerably longer. I also received a single document titled Trial Architecture Parameters, Candidate Summary Version. The summary version was 4 pages long. The full parameters document existed, but would not be made available to us, because part of what the architecture assessed was how candidates responded to incomplete information. I read my summary document twice, folded it in the left pocket of my trial kit. The Vether cadet in the adjacent alcove, Soren Kale, watched me do this. "You have read it already," he said. His translator rendered his speech in a dry, slightly clicking cadence that I found easier to follow than most. "Twice. You will not read it again? I'll know when I need to." He looked at me with his 4 eyes, were arranged in a horizontal row across his face like readings on a gauge. I had no idea what expression he was making. Something about his stillness felt less like hostility than evaluation. The kind of look you give a variable you haven't fully accounted for yet. "You are the human," he said. "Solis, yes. The observer track candidate who requested trial candidacy. That's me." He was quiet for a moment. "The other cadets are discussing whether this is a deliberate stress introduction by the architecture's administrators, an element inserted into the cohort to generate social pressure. A plant, you mean?" "Yes." "Are you?" "No." He considered this. "That is also what a planted element would say." "Yes," I agreed. "It is." He made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else entirely, turned back to his alcove, and unfolded his own summary document. He read it 4 times. I know because I was counting. The architecture's first move was simple and deliberate, and I respected it for being both. 2100 on the first night, 3 hours after the standard rest cycle began, the lights went out completely. Not a dimming, not a transition to low-maintenance glow. Off. Full dark, the kind that doesn't exist on a station any other time because there is always something emitting somewhere. A status light, a power conduit, a screen in sleep mode. This was dark with all of those things removed. A manufactured dark that took effort and intention to make. I lay on my bunk and listened. 3 seconds after the lights went, I heard Soren Kale shift position. 8 seconds after that, a murmur from somewhere in the ring, one of the other cadets, speaking quietly in a language my translator wasn't catching. 15 seconds after that, a longer sound from the far side of the room, two voices overlapping, one of them with a sharp quality that I read as urgency. Then the silence came back, and the quality of it had changed again. It was heavier now. The architecture, I suspected, was adjusting something in the atmospheric composition of the room, just enough to make the silence feel more inhabited than it had before. Not threatening, just inhabited. Full of something that hadn't been named yet. My hands behind my head, and stared at where the ceiling was. In the Namib grid, on the nights, when the interference from the Soabus formation was running heavy, and the field lights went, and your headlamp gave you 12 feet of visibility at best, you learned very quickly the difference between two kinds of dark. The dark that had something in it, and the dark that was just dark. The difference wasn't something you could describe precisely to another person. It was pattern recognition built up over enough nights in enough fields with enough things that might or might not have been moving in the periphery of your lamp's reach. The Namib dark had taught me to wait before I decided what I was looking at, to let the dark be dark for long enough to see what it actually contained rather than what my nervous system wanted to put in it. The architecture's dark had nothing in it. I went to sleep. I don't know exactly when the first candidate requested extraction. I know it was before morning, because when I woke at 0530 to use the facility's sanitation station, I counted the alcoves, and one of them was empty. The trial kit was still on the bunk. They never took the kit, just the candidate, and the impression in the bunk fabric was still visible. Whoever it had left at some point in the night, quietly without waking anyone. The trial's extraction mechanism was designed for this. You activated the request signal on your kit. The architecture logged it. Transit staff came during the next non-active cycle window. Quiet. No announcement. The architecture wanted the remaining candidates to notice the absence, not the act. I noticed both. Over breakfast, the supplement block came in 3 temperature variants, none of which were good, all of which were adequate. I made my first manual log entry. Time, date, observation of 1 absence, physical status, atmospheric notes. The facility's air had a very faint metallic edge to it that had not been there the previous day. Not unpleasant, not medically relevant. The architecture wouldn't risk liability exposure through genuine physiological harm, but designed to be mildly dysphoric. The specific quality of it sat in the back of the throat like old machinery. You noticed something was off without being able to name exactly what, which meant your brain kept allocating small amounts of processing effort to the problem without ever resolving it. I noted this. I ate. Soren Kale sat 3 positions down the common table. He watched me log. You write everything, he said. Habit from survey work. The data that seems irrelevant is the data that ends up mattering. What are you noting now? Air composition is running a trace variant, slightly metallic, not dangerous. The architecture wouldn't risk liability, but designed to be mildly dysphoric, settling without being explicable. You notice something's off, but you can't name what. He was quiet for a long moment, then I noticed it when I woke. I attributed it to the stress response of adjacent candidates affecting my sensory calibration. It might be both, I said. The architecture layers, it's not just one thing at a time. How do you know this? The summary document describes the architecture's design philosophy in the 3rd paragraph of the 2nd page. Graduated, layered protocols, no single point of destabilization. It wants you working to account for multiple inputs at once, so none of them get your full attention, and all of them slowly drain your processing load. I took a piece of the supplement block. It's good design. He looked at the block in my hand. You admire it. I understand it, that's not the same thing. I ate. But yes, it's clean work. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. The second candidate was gone by midday. I noted the absence in my log and kept eating. The second night was more complex. The architecture had finished its basic profiling pass from the first cycle and was beginning individualized protocols. The summary document had described this as Phase 2 without specifying what Phase 2 contained, which was itself part of the architecture's design. Each candidate would experience Phase 2 differently because the architecture had each candidate's neurological map and intended to use it precisely. What mattered to the Vethar would not be what mattered to the Sorvan. What mattered to the Sorvan would not be what mattered to the human. What the architecture did to me specifically began at approximately 2300 station time and involved sound, not loud sound, not the jarring intrusion of alarms or sudden impacts that the summary document's language around acute auditory stress had led me to half expect. The architecture was smarter than that. What it did was introduce, at just below the threshold of conscious notice, a low repeating tone at a frequency that my intake profile had apparently identified as particularly dissonant to human auditory processing. It was the frequency of bad weather on shortwave radio, of a compressor failing at the edge of your campsite at 3 in the morning, of mechanical distress in something you were relying on, the frequency of something about to break that hasn't broken yet. Felt it before I heard it. A faint unease, sourceless, not unpleasant enough to name, but persistent enough to interrupt sleep architecture in the way that a small constant irritant interrupts sleep, not by waking you, but by preventing the deeper rest cycles. The architecture had designed it to feel like there was something wrong that you should be checking on, without ever being specific about what. Your body wanted to investigate. Your body was convinced, at the level below language, that something in the room needed attention. I lay on my bunk and ran the Namib protocol. The Namib protocol isn't a formal thing. It doesn't have a name. What it is, practically, is a habit developed over 8 months of working in a region where the ambient electromagnetic distortion produced sensory artifacts in virtually every piece of equipment you carried. Artifacts that looked, to your tired brain at 3 in the morning, like signals worth chasing, lights in the sky, sounds in the rock, temperature gradients that didn't correspond to any wind you could feel. The survey team called them ghost readings, and the first rule of ghost readings was that you did not go looking for what had made them until you had confirmed by 2 independent means that there was something actually there. The second rule of ghost readings was this: ghost reading that does not escalate is not a signal. It is noise. Noise does not require a response. Noise requires patience. You sit with noise and you let it run, and you note that it is running, and you do not mistake it for a request. I listened to the tone for 40 minutes. It did not escalate. It oscillated at the same mild, gnawing frequency without changing in pitch or volume or cadence, steady as a pulse. The architecture was waiting for my sleep-deprived brain to interpret the constancy of the discomfort as evidence of a real and ongoing problem. It was a reasonable strategy. Constancy is how the body learns threat. The body was built to attend to things that don't go away, because things that don't go away in the wild often mean something. A sound that runs all night without varying is a sound you should probably understand before you sleep near it. I had spent enough time in the wild to have learned to push back against that particular instinct. Not to suppress it. Suppression was the wrong move, because suppressed instinct stored energy and released it later at inconvenient times, but to evaluate it and then consciously set it aside when the evaluation came back clean. The evaluation came back clean. The tone was not escalating. It was not varying. It was doing exactly and only what it had been doing for the previous 40 minutes. Was running at a frequency designed to make me feel like I should be doing something. I had logged it. I had evaluated it. I was done with it. I slept at roughly 100. Not well, in the sense that the tone was still present, still gnawing faintly at the edge of consciousness. But I slept. In the morning, 2 more alcoves were empty. Day 3 was when the architecture changed direction. The light came back on at dawn, as it had the day before. But there was something wrong with it. Not the intensity. The intensity was normal, the room as bright as it had been on day 1. It was the quality. The spectrum had been shifted, barely perceptibly, into a range that made shadows fall at angles that didn't correspond to the light source. Your eye tracked the light to its origin, a standard overhead panel in the center of the room, and then tracked a shadow that went the other way. For a fraction of a second, your visual processing system did a recount, chasing the discrepancy, trying to reconcile 2 pieces of geometric information that should have agreed and didn't. By the time it finished, the next shadow had already gone wrong. It was, I thought, genuinely elegant work. Most sensory disruption operates by removing or distorting, taking something away, making things too loud or too quiet or too dark. This was additive. It added something that didn't belong. The light was all there, fully present, doing its job. It had just been precisely misconfigured so that your visual field contained, at all times, a small ongoing impossibility that your brain could not ignore. Every time your eye moved, the inconsistency presented itself again. Every time you thought you'd accounted for it, there was another shadow going the wrong direction. I sat with my morning supplement block and watched the shadows for 20 minutes. The architecture wanted you to chase them, to look at the wrong angle and then check again, and then check again. Burning processing load in an endless verification loop and generating a quiet, sustained anxiety that would compound hour over hour, day over day, until your nervous system was spending more cycles on ambient verification than on anything else. Until you were, essentially, too busy confirming that the room was wrong to do anything else in the room. Picked a fixed reference point, the seam where the far wall met the ceiling, and decided that was my anchor. A simple manufactured right angle, nothing special about it. No particular reason the architecture would have spent effort calibrating it. Neutral ground. Everything outside the anchor could do what it liked. I would not be verifying it. I was watching the anchor. Siren found me doing this and sat down beside me without asking. He was looking worse than he had the day before, which was meaningful because Vithar physiology was not easy to read. His horizontal eye array had a slight asymmetry, the second eye from the left, tracking a beat behind the others. Fatigue marker. Vithar discoordination of the optical set indicates advanced stress response, according to the orientation materials we'd all received at intake. The light, he said. Yes, you have found a method for it. Fixed reference point. Anchor. Anything that falls outside the anchor I don't verify. He was quiet for a long moment. Requires trusting that the anchor is stable. Yes. How do you trust that? I looked at the seam. It was just a seam. I chose it, I said. The architecture didn't give it to me. It didn't mark it or highlight it or draw my attention to it. I found it myself, at random, because I needed a stable point. That means it's more likely to be neutral ground. The architecture wasn't thinking about it when it's set up. Light variance because the architecture was thinking about the shadows. I paused. Also, I sat here for 20 minutes before you arrived and it hasn't moved. He looked at the seam. May I use your anchor, he said. Yes, I said. We sat together and looked at the seam where the far wall met the ceiling and ate our supplement blocks in silence. By the end of day 3, 4 more candidates had extracted. We were down to 8. Of the remaining 8, only 3, Siren and 2 others I had not yet spoken to, showed the behavioral markers of active coping rather than passive deterioration. The others were present, functional, but running on deficit. You could see it in the quality of their attention, the way their gaze moved around the room without settling, always tracking, always verifying, never resting. The architecture had been in the room for 3 days, and it was already doing its arithmetic. Day 4 was the worst of the first week. What the architecture did on day 4 was not new, in the sense that it used tools it had already introduced. The light variance was still running. Tonal frequency was still there beneath the audible threshold. The atmospheric trace was still metallic, still occupying the back of the throat, with its suggestion of something failing nearby. But on day 4, the architecture began running them in coordinated pulses, not simultaneously escalated, but rhythmically staggered, so that just as your system adjusted to the shadow discrepancy, the tone shifted frequency by 3 measurable units, and the metallic trace thickened, slightly, and just as you readjusted to those, the light variance deepened fractionally, and then the tone shifted again, and then the atmospheric trace eased back slightly, only to rebuild over the following 20 minutes. It was a ratchet. Not a sudden turn, click, and a pause, and another click, and another pause, each click advancing the load by some small fraction that was individually manageable, and collectively grinding. The architecture was no longer trying to break anyone with a single large event. It was compounding. On the Lofoten deep mapping rotation, there was a week in late November when the storms ran continuously for 8 days. Dramatic storms. Not the kind that send things flying and demand your full operational attention. Low, grinding, Unceasing gales that kept the temperature at -17 and filled every exterior sensor with noise and made the tent fabric sound, at all times, like something was pulling at it from outside. By day 4 of that stretch, I had categorized the sound into 11 distinct types, 7 of which were tent fabric movement from wind variants, 3 of which were wind effects on the equipment lashing, and 1 of which was, in fact, once a snow petrel that had lost its reference in the whiteness and landed on the tent apex with a sound like someone setting down a careful package. I knew the difference by day 4 because I had spent days 1 through 3 cataloging. Cataloging does 2 things. It gives you accurate information about what you're actually dealing with, and it gives your nervous system something useful to do with the ambient data, rather than simply accumulating it as unresolved threat. An unresolved threat stays in the queue forever, drawing resources. A cataloged observation gets filed and frees the queue for the next thing. I got out my manual log and started entering observations. Architecture ratchet cycle duration. Approximately 42 minutes per complete sequence. Individual element shifts. Light variance advancing 3 to 4 units per cycle. Tonal frequency shifts, irregular in timing, biased toward the lower register after 1800 station time. Atmospheric trace, heaviest at a 3 road, diminishing by 0600, reintroduced at approximately 1400. Pattern indicates the architecture is running a modified fatigue amplification protocol. The Eero 300 atmospheric spike is timed to intersect with natural sleep trough C in most carbon-based species, the period when the body's regulatory systems are at their lowest ebb, and ambient stimuli have maximum impact on the waking or sleeping threshold. I noted that I didn't know exactly what the sleep trough was for my specific physiology in this specific atmospheric composition, which meant the O300 spike might be timed wrong for me. I flagged this as worth monitoring. Soren Kale watched me write. He had not been sleeping well. The eye tracking made this evident, but he was still present, still eating his supplement block every morning and every evening, without being reminded, still sitting with his back to the wall and his hands visible in his lap, in what I had come to read as his deliberate regulation posture. He was working. He just didn't have a method that was working yet. "What are you writing?" he said. "Not a question exactly. Ratchet cycle data. The architecture is running its protocols on a compressed escalation pattern. I'm logging the intervals." "To what end?" "When something is predictable, it costs you less," I said. "If I can predict the next shift, the shift doesn't register as unexpected input when it arrives. It registers as a confirmed prediction. My nervous system doesn't have to process it as new information." He was quiet then. "You are trying to make the architecture boring." I looked at him. "Yes," I said, "that's exactly right. The ratchet ran its evening cycle at 2100. At 2300, one of the candidates make a single sharp vocalization and activate his extraction request. I noted the time in my log. The architecture would note it too in its own record, and the 2 records would agree. 7 remaining. Day 5. The architecture's largest move on day 5 came from patience. By day 5 it had data on all of us. 4 full days of individual response patterns, failure modes identified, partial successes noted. It had tried a range of tools and observed how each of us processed them, and it had been learning. The ratchet work had consumed 2 candidates. The light variance had worn down 3 more. Tonal frequency had extracted 1 in the first night and contributed to the slow decline of 2 others. What remained of the cohort were 8 people, and then 7, and then 6, and then by the end of day 4, 5, who had found partial methods of managing 1 or more of the architecture's tools. The architecture's response to partial success was not to abandon its tools. It was to stop using the tools that weren't working, and to concentrate the load on the gaps in each candidate's partial method. It was, if you thought about it plainly, the obvious move, the intelligent move. You do not keep pushing against a wall that has been reinforced. You find where the reinforcement stops. What it did to Soren Kale on day 5, I did not observe directly. I was aware of it in the way you are aware of someone else's hard weather when you are walking the same ground. His eye array lost coordination by mid-morning. By afternoon, he was sitting with his back against the common room wall, eyes forward, not moving. Not in distress exactly, He was still present, still processing, but he had gone somewhere quieter inside himself, the place you go when external input has overloaded the system. And the system needs to reduce throughput to preserve core function. He was doing the right thing. You go quiet when the volume is too high. You protect the core and wait. Recognized it as a valid response and left him to it. I sat with him for a while. I didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say, and saying something would have cost him processing bandwidth he needed for other things. Sometimes, the most useful thing you can do for another person in a difficult stretch is simply be present without demanding anything in return. The architecture did to me on day 5 involved memory. I don't know how it did this. The summary document had mentioned, in one brief line toward the end of page 3, something called associative environmental cue layering, which was the kind of language not the describe mechanism without describing what it does. What it did in practice was this. The architecture had assembled, from my intake cognitive profile, a composite of sensory data associated with high-stress periods, not the memories themselves. The architecture didn't have those, but the sensory signatures, the specific patterns of input my nervous system associated with situations that had demanded everything. The Namib grid, late November, Delgado broke his ankle in the Soabis formation on day 47 of the mapping rotation, and we had 12 kilometers to the emergency cache, and the interference was running at full strength. And I was navigating by compass and dead reckoning in a region where the magnetic deviation was documented at 11 degrees, and we had been awake for 22 hours. That was the memory the architecture was fishing for. I could feel it the way you feel a word sitting at the edge of recall. Not the thing itself, but the outline of its shadow, the particular quality of attention it demands. The architecture was running a specific atmospheric acoustic composite, designed to bring that shadow closer, to make the room feel like that November without being that November, so that my nervous system would begin responding to present conditions with protocols developed for a situation that was no longer relevant. To use the past against the present, it was smart work. I had a conversation with myself that lasted, by my log's timestamp, about 11 minutes. The shape of the conversation was this. The situation you are in right now is not the situation you are being made to remember. The architecture has correctly identified a stress signature from your history, and it is broadcasting a facsimile of that signature at you, precisely calibrated to feel familiar enough to trigger the original response. The facsimile is not the situation. The situation you are in right now is a sealed facility on a station, day 5 of a 90-hour trial, in which you are physically comfortable, physiologically stable, adequately nourished, and in no genuine danger. Delgado is fine. His ankle healed. He was back in the field 6 weeks later, and we ran the Atacama grid together the following spring without incident. You know this. I logged what the architecture was doing. I described the composite as accurately as I could. I noted the specific sensory elements it had assembled and which historical context they were pointing toward. I noted how it had done it, not the mechanism, which I couldn't identify, but the effect. The faint background resonance of cold metal in the air, adjusted just so. The tonal frequency shifted a few units lower, into the register that the Namib wind made at altitude when it moved through survey, stakes left in dry ground. A mild pressure differential in the room that mimicked the change in air density that preceded a drop in temperature by several hours, the kind of change a body notices long before a thermometer confirms it. It had assembled these with care. The architecture of the composite was precise in a way that told me whoever had built the intake profiling system understood not just what stressed a human nervous system in the abstract, but the specific mechanism by which stress got built up over time, not through single dramatic inputs, through an accumulation of small correct details that added up to a feeling before they added up to a thought. That was the thing I had to be careful about. The feeling was not the fact. I had the conversation with myself that I have already described. The situation you are in right now is not the situation you are being made to remember. The architecture has correctly identified a stress signature from your history, and it is broadcasting a facsimile of that signature at you, precisely calibrated to feel familiar enough to trigger the original response. The facsimile is not the situation. Then I asked myself the practical question, the one that mattered. What do you do in the next hour? The answer was what it always was. You log. You eat. You note the time and the ambient conditions and the state of your body and mind, and you keep the record accurate. You treat the present as the present, not as a rehearsal of the past. I logged what the architecture was doing. I described the composite as accurately as I could. I assigned the whole observation a catalog number, 47 ASOC Nov Composite full amplitude. Then I ate half a supplement block and wrote up my log entries from the night before. 2 more cadets extracted before dinner. 5 remaining. On the morning of day 6, Vathul sat down next to me. He was a Keth Sorvan cadet, compact and dark-plated, the color of deep water. He had been almost entirely silent for 5 days. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, the silence of someone who was doing significant work in a place other people couldn't see. He had survived the first 5 days without visible deterioration, which was meaningful. He also had the look of someone who had been carrying weight without equipment. You could manage weight without equipment for a considerable time, but the cost accumulated. And he was starting to show it in the set of his posture. He watched me work through the cycle prediction log for a while before he said anything. You are mapping it, he said. Yes, you have been mapping it since day 1. Day 2. Day 1 I was still assessing whether pattern mapping was the right approach. He looked at my log without asking to read it, which I respected. Does it help, the mapping? Yes. How? I thought about how to explain this accurately rather than impressively. When something is unexpected, your nervous system has to decide very quickly what category of response it requires. Is this a threat? Is this a false alarm? Is this something I've seen before? That decision process is fast and automatic, and it works well for most situations, but it has a specific failure mode. If the inputs keep coming and the decisions keep being required, and none of them resolve into clear action, the decision process starts to accumulate debt. You get tired. Not physically tired, cognitively tired. The architecture is designed to generate exactly that kind of debt, in sufficient volume that you can't service it. Vathul watched me. Mapping converts unexpected inputs into expected ones. If I've predicted that the light variance is going to shift at 0400, then when it shifts at 0400, it's not an unexpected input. It's a confirmed prediction. My nervous system doesn't have to process it as new information. It's already filed. The decision is already made. I paused. It doesn't make the light stop being wrong, but it stops the light from costing me anything. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he was done and returned to my log. Then, on my home station before the academy, worked maintenance on the environmental control systems of a deep ice extraction facility. 14 months. The systems failed at irregular intervals, in various combinations in ways that were not always predictable. There was no pattern document. There was no senior technician to ask. I was the only person certified for those systems on that rotation. He paused. I developed a similar method. Not writing, I memorized the failure patterns. I made predictions. When the systems failed the way I expected, I was ready. When they failed unexpectedly, I had enough processing reserve remaining to handle it. Yes, I said. That's exactly it. He nodded once. He sat for another moment, and then he got out his own document pages. The blank sheets he'd been given along with the log, which he had been keeping clean, unused, carrying everything internally, and started writing. He had been observing without logging for 5 days, holding all of it in working memory, which explained why he was still functional, but showing the strain of carrying a load without any place to set it down. The log pages gave him somewhere to put it. Within an hour, he had filled 4 of them. I watched him work for a while, not intrusively. There was something satisfying about watching a person discover a tool that fit. Not because I had taught it to him. I hadn't, not exactly. I had described a principle and he had found the tool himself, but because the fit was evident. He wrote differently than I did. Shorter entries, more compressed. A kind of notation shorthand that I could see was a direct extension of the failure pattern memorization system he'd developed at the extraction facility. Not my method. His method adapted to paper, better for him than mine would have been. By evening he had 30 pages of notes, and the look of someone who had found a way to breathe. The ratchet, he said, late that afternoon, Preamble. Yes, it is not escalating today. I checked my cycle prediction log. No, it's holding at approximately the day 4 peak. Consistent amplitude, consistent interval, plateau phase. What does that mean for tomorrow? I thought about it honestly. Either it holds here for another cycle, and then begins the phase 3 escalation the summary document mentions. Or it's already in phase 3, and what we think of as the plateau is actually the new baseline, the level from which the final deployment will run. Paused. I don't know which. Cycle data is ambiguous. He wrote this down. Not the conclusion, the uncertainty. He filed the uncertainty as data, which was the right move. The plateau is still uncomfortable, he said. Yes, but it is survivable. Yes. He nodded, slowly, and went back to his notes. 5 remaining on day 6. The 3 of us, Soren Kale, Vathul and I and 2 others, Thresh Kale and Ven Marath, who had been managing in their own ways, and whom I had been observing with the same attention I gave everything else in this room. Thresh Kale was holding, but barely. The light variance was doing the most work on him. His species had a particularly acute visual processing system, fine-grained enough to pick up the shadow discrepancies with a clarity that I, with my comparatively coarse human visual architecture, simply didn't have to deal with. He couldn't use the anchor in the same way I did, because the anchor didn't block the shadows out of his peripheral vision. It just gave him a reference point, and his reference point kept being challenged by the peripheral incorrectness that was too sharp for him to ignore. Ven Marath was doing well. Better, I thought, than she let on. Or perhaps not letting on was itself part of her method. Vithar, I had gathered from the orientation materials, had a cultural orientation toward private processing. The idea that the management of difficulty was an internal matter, and its outward expression was a kind of cost. She spent her energy on the trial, not on the performance of managing the trial. I respected this considerably. Day 7 was when the architecture showed what it had actually built. I had been expecting something significant. The summary documents language around Phase 3 had been careful in a way that suggested Phase 3 was where the system stopped being subtle. The cycle data I'd accumulated in my log supported this. The ratchet pattern had been incrementally tightening for 2 days, the individual elements compressing towards shorter intervals, the gaps between adjustments narrowing. A system building toward a threshold event, releasing stored pressure. What the threshold event turned out to be was a simultaneous full-amplitude deployment of every tool the architecture had, individually in days 1 through 6. Not a ratchet, not a gradual turn. One coordinated activation, light variance at maximum, tonal frequency at maximum, atmospheric trace at its heaviest concentration, the associative Q composite running at full signal, and something new. A pressure. A physical sensation of ambient weight in the room that had no specific source point, that seemed to come from every surface at once, and that my intake profile had apparently flagged as particularly destabilizing to human vestibular processing. The pressure was real, not imagined. I felt it in my inner ear, in the slight counterintuitive lean of my body's sense of balance, few degrees off from where level actually was. The architecture had, by some mechanism I couldn't identify in the moment, introduced a sustained disorientation into the room's physical environment. When I stood, the floor was exactly where it should have been. When I reached for something, my hand arrived where it was supposed to. The geometry was correct. But my inner ear was receiving a signal that disagreed with the geometry, and the conflict between those two data streams was the specific kind of cognitive cost that compounds fastest and resolves slowest. This was, professionally speaking, impressive work. I sat down on the floor, not because I was in distress, because sitting down removed the vestibular input from the equation. If you're on the floor, you cannot fall further. If there's no balance to maintain, the balance disruption has no purchase. I sat with my back against the wall of my log, on my knees, and I worked through the escalation, in the same way I had worked through every other escalation in the previous 6 days. I named what each component was, noted its amplitude, predicted the duration based on cycle data, and filed it. Pressure ran for 3 hours at full amplitude. During those 3 hours, Kale, a Sorvan cadet who had been coping adequately through the first 6 days, activated his extraction request. I heard the signal sequence, counted 4 breaths, kept writing. Soren Kale moved to the floor independently, approximately 14 minutes after I did, without prompting. He sat against the adjacent wall and looked at the same seam we had been using as an anchor since day 3 and did not say anything. Vath-Ul, I noticed, had already been seated on the floor for reasons that might or might not have been related to the pressure event. He may have predicted it. Venmarath stayed at the common table. She was a Vithar cadet whose name I had not learned until day 4 because she had been so consistently quiet and so consistently self-contained that there had been no natural occasion. She was the only one of the cadets who had developed, independently and without apparent awareness of what I was doing, a comparable approach to the trial's conditions. She had found her own anchor on day 3 in a different part of the room from mine. She had been using a respiratory regulation protocol since day 1 that I recognized as a structured breathing method, kind that special operations candidates use to maintain functional performance during elevated physiological stress. She had not told anyone she was doing this, and she had not performed it demonstratively. She had simply been doing it, quietly, as a tool she'd already had. She braced her forearms on the common table surface, found her anchor with her eyes, breathed in long, deliberate cycles while the room did its worst. 4 of us made it through day 7. Day 8. The architecture, having run its full deployment, entered what I had logged as the dissolution phase. The gradual reduction of active protocols, not because the trial was over. It was not. We had approximately 30 hours remaining, but because a system that has deployed its core toolkit needs to assess the results before determining what comes next. The intensity dropped across day 8. This was the architecture's most subtle play. Reduced intensity after sustained high-pressure feels, to a stressed nervous system, like relief. Like the worst is over. Like, you have passed through the hardest part and the rest will be easier. The nervous system, which has been running at elevated load for days and wants very badly to stand down, will accept this interpretation eagerly. It will begin releasing the vigilance protocols it has been holding. It will begin allowing the kind of cognitive drift that comes with lowered guard, the small, comfortable errors of judgment that accumulate when you decide you have handled something and can now relax. I noted in my log that we had approximately 30 hours remaining. I noted that I felt substantially better than I had the previous day. I noted that these 2 facts deserved careful examination before I acted on the second one. The reduction in active protocols had an interesting secondary effect. The 4 of us who remained began, almost involuntarily, to spend more time in the common area together. We had been largely solitary for days, not by deliberate isolation, but because the architecture's conditions demanded individual attention, and there was limited bandwidth for anything else. Now, with the ambient pressure eased, we were in the same room, sitting in reasonable proximity, occasionally talking. Soren Kale's IRA had recoordinated by morning. Vath-Ul was writing steadily in his borrowed log pages. Venmarath had moved from the common table to the floor beside the wall that held her anchor. She was doing the respiratory protocol in a more deliberate way now. The kind of deliberate that meant she was processing something, rather than just maintaining baseline. At some point in the late morning, Soren Kale said, "When this is complete, what is the post-trial sequence?" "Cognitive baseline reassessment," I said. "Same battery as intake. The architecture runs a comparison, your post-trial results against your pre-trial baseline, to generate the performance metric. And then, results go to the director of trial candidacy and your institutional record. You get a tier assessment. If you hit the threshold, you advance to the next track. What is the threshold? The summary document doesn't specify. You have made a prediction," he said. I had. I'd noted it in the log on day 5. "I think the threshold is completion," I said. "The trial isn't measuring how well you perform under the architecture's conditions. It's measuring whether you remain functional enough to perform at all. If you're sitting at the post-trial assessment station ready to take the baseline reassessment on day 9, you passed," Vath-Ul said, without looking up from his writing. "It would explain the extraction mechanism. The candidates who extracted are not disqualified from future trial candidacy. The architecture does not issue a failure notation. It issues an extraction record. The distinction matters. Extraction is not failure. It is the decision about when to stop. Yes, I said. That's what I think. Ven Marath, sitting with her arms folded and her eyes half closed, said without opening them fully. Then the trial is not testing our scores. It is testing our decisions. Among other things, I said. She opened her eyes. They were deep amber. Unusual for Vethar, and they had a steadiness to them that I had been noticing for several days. She had been quiet for 8 days, but she had not been passive. She had been attending. There was a difference. You have been awake for most of the trial, she said. Not a question. I've slept about 30 to 35 hours total across 8 days. And you are still logging? Yes. She looked at my log. What do you do with it after? I thought about this. I give it to whoever is interested, I said. The architecture's design team, maybe, if they want it. It's observation data. It might be useful to someone. She was quiet for a moment then. The architecture was calibrated for species whose stress response is primarily somatic, cortical disruption propagating down through physical symptoms, fear that lands in the body. She paused. For Vethar, it is the reverse. Physical disruption propagating upward. The body holds. The mind gives. She looked at her hands. I have been managing the physical protocols without difficulty. It is the associative cue work, the memories, that cost. Yes, I said. It found what costs each of us. And for you? A November in the Namib. A colleague with a broken ankle, 12 kilometers in the dark. I looked at my log. It kept trying to make this room feel like that. It almost managed it twice. Almost, she said. Almost, I said. Day 8 passed. Night 8 passed. We were 4. Day 9. The architecture ran a final low-amplitude sequence in the morning. A brief activation of each of its tools in turn. Light, sound, air, pressure. 3 seconds each, then off. I thought of it as the architecture confirming it was still there, still present, still watching. A reminder that the dissolution phase had been a measured withdrawal, not a surrender. I noted it in my log. I gave it the same catalog number format I had given every other observation. Then I lay on my bunk and read through my log from the beginning. 7 entries. Approximately 94 pages of handwritten observation, prediction, confirmation, and catalog notation. The architecture's full pattern was in there, legible, coherent, describable, in terms anyone with the relevant background could use. The phase structure, the cycle intervals, the individualized protocol logic, the timing of the associative cue composite work and the specific atmospheric elements it had used to construct the November composite. All of it. I had not cracked the architecture. That was not the right framing, and I did not want to write it that way. The architecture was well built, and it had done exactly what it was designed to do to 11 of 15 candidates in this cohort. What I had done was refuse to let it process me as data without processing it back. I had treated the architecture the way I treated the Tsuebis formation in the dark, as an environment that could be understood, that had patterns, be cataloged and predicted and thereby diffused. Not defeated, diffused. There is a difference. I got up at 06:30. I ate the last pieces of my supplement block. I made a note of the time and the status of my physical systems, which were fatigued but functional, and the status of my log, which was complete pending the final entry. The trial closed at 600, day 10. 23 and a half hours remaining. I spent the last 23 hours of the trial doing 3 things. I finished my log. I wrote the final entries with the same care I had given the first ones, including a full summary analysis of the architecture's phase structure, cycle intervals, and what I assessed to be its primary diagnostic functions as distinct from its stated ones. Whether anyone would read this analysis was not a consideration. The work was worth doing because it was the work. You write it up because you were there and because accuracy matters. And because the next person who walks into that environment deserves whatever data you were able to collect. I slept, not the fragmented monitoring for threat sleep of the early days. Real sleep, 7 hours of it, beginning at 1400 and ending at 2100. The architecture's silence had given me the space for it, and I used the space without hesitation. And I talked to the 3 people who had made it through with me. We sat in the common area on the last evening, the 4 of us in what had become, without anyone designating it, our usual arrangement, Soren, Kale, and I at one end of the table. Vafel riding steadily at the other. Ben Marath on the floor against the wall, with her anchor in her eyeline. And we talked about things that had nothing to do with the trial. Soren Kale had been raised in the northern transit corridors of the Thun sector. He described the geography with precision and without sentiment. The way people describe places they know well, rather than places they are trying to make sound interesting. He had a way of naming landmarks that made them feel real, not painted, just there. The way actual places are just there. Faith Ull talked about the deep ice extraction facility. About the specific sounds the environmental control systems made when they were running correctly, the baseline signature that meant everything was within parameters, and how you trained your ear to the baseline until any deviation became immediately audible. The deviation was never loud, he said. It was always small. That was the only kind of warning the systems gave. Ven Marath talked about the emergency response unit on her home station, 2 years before the academy. She described a particular incident, a pressure failure in one of the agricultural rings, 3 hours of controlled evacuation. While the structure held on tolerances it was not designed to maintain indefinitely. In the same flat, precise way she did everything. No drama in the telling. Just what happened, in the order it happened, and what the correct response to each development had been. She asked me what I called the catalog method. I told her I didn't have a name for it. I'd just been doing it since the Namib, and by the time I was doing it consistently enough to call it anything, it had stopped needing a name. She thought about this for a while. Then she said, "On my station, the emergency response instructors called it the practice of naming. When you name a thing, when you give it a catalog number and a description and a predicted duration, you stop being afraid of it. Thing becomes a fact. Facts have responses. Fear does not." "Yes," I said, "that's exactly it." We were quiet for a while after that, in the way you are quiet, with people you have spent 9 days in a difficult place with, and have reached the end of the difficult place and do not need to fill the quiet. The closure siren ran at 0600, day 10. The trial's first siren marked the official end of the sealed sequence and initiated the post-trial transition window. Candidates were directed to the assessment station, a room adjacent to the main common area, 6 individual testing units, baseline cognitive battery available for completion at the candidate's own pace. The assessment window ran for 6 hours. I had been sitting at the assessment station since 0537. This was not planning or performance. I had woken at 0445, gone through my morning routine, finished the last entry in my log, and found myself with approximately an hour to use before the closure signal. The assessment station was unlocked. It had been unlocked for the duration of the trial as a standard accessibility protocol, and any candidate could have come here at any point in the 9 days. And the baseline battery was loaded in the testing units. I sat down and started. Cognitive baseline battery, 4 sections. Pattern recognition, logical sequencing, memory retrieval under cognitive load, and adaptive response to novel stimulus configurations. I had taken the same battery at intake, before the trial, and had scored in the standard range for adult human cognitive function, with a notation that the architecture's calibration system had flagged my memory retrieval subsection as running at an unusual processing pattern, not superior performance, exactly, but a method that the calibration team had filed as requiring further observation. I worked through the battery steadily. Pattern recognition, 40 questions, 11 minutes. Logical sequencing, 35 questions, 10 minutes. I was moving more carefully than I had at intake. The fatigue was real, and careful was better than fast at this point in the trial. But the questions themselves were the kind of thing that fatigue didn't really touch. The underlying pattern recognition that lived in a register below where the architecture had been working. Memory retrieval, 50 questions. This section was designed to apply cognitive load mid-task, introducing and interrupting stimulus at irregular intervals while the candidate was engaged in active memory work. The stimulus at the intake assessment had been a mild tonal intrusion, the same frequency band the architecture had, spent 9 days running at me in gradually increasing amplitude. I recognized it on the first interruption. I noted, in the small comment field beside question 14, that I was familiar with this frequency range. I meant this as a practical notation for whoever reviewed the battery, not as a remark. It seemed worth having in the record. I finished the memory retrieval section in 19 minutes. The closure siren sounded at 0600. I was on the first question of the adaptive response section. The adaptive response section, 42 questions, designed to present stimuli the candidate had never encountered before and assess processing speed and accuracy under novel conditions. Novel stimuli, by definition, could not be practiced for, which meant the only useful preparation was the general preparation of keeping your processing systems as clear as possible so they had reserves available. I had been doing this for 9 days. I finished the adaptive response section at 0612, 2 questions, 12 minutes. I submitted the battery and sat back in the chair. Through the door to the common area, I could hear the post-trial intake staff doff beginning their entry procedures. The gate, unsealing, footsteps, the low ambient noise of the station outside re-entering the space for the first time in 9 days. A few minutes later, 2 of the other assessment units activated, Vath Ul and Soren Kale, taking their seats, beginning their batteries. A moment later, Venmarath, the 4 of us, spread across 6 stations, working. I looked at my completed unit display. I looked at my log, which I had carried with me, and set on the edge of the testing station at 0537. I thought about Delgado, 12 kilometers in the dark, without complaining. About the 11 distinct sounds the tent had made in the 8-day storm, and which one of them had turned out to be a snow petrel. About Vathul's face on the morning of day 6, when he had sat down with borrowed log, and, for the first time in 5 days, given himself somewhere to put what he had been carrying. The second siren ran at 0620. Administrative protocol, a reminder that the assessment window was running. A formal notation of time elapsed since the closure signal. Candidates who had not yet presented at the assessment station, it was a prompt. For candidates who had already submitted their battery, it was background noise. I was the only candidate who had already submitted. The second siren cleared. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet at the end of things. I opened my log and wrote the final entry. 9 days, 4 survivors, 112 catalog observations, 47 log entries, trial complete. Battery submitted at 0612, second siren at 062. I noted the time differential, which was 8 minutes, and I noted my status at the time of the second siren, which was completed, submitted, sitting in a chair with my log open and the pen still in my hand. I added one more line, because it was true and because I wanted it in the record. The 3 people who made it through this trial alongside me were genuinely competent, not only in the way the trial measured, though they were that, but in the larger way. They had found methods. They had adapted. They had stayed in the field when the field turned bad. In the survey work, that was the only thing that was ever really being assessed. Director Vath Keln reviewed my trial results 9 days later. I know this because Proctor Vethsel found me in the observation wing common room and told me, in the careful tone she used for things she was not certain how to file, "The director has reviewed your trial results and your post-trial battery," she said. All right. Battery rates completion time flagged an anomaly in the architecture's post-trial processing system. She paused. You completed the full battery prior to the second siren. Yes. No candidate has previously completed the full battery prior to the second siren. She set a document on the table beside me. The architecture's post-trial processing system was not designed with a classification code for this. Outcome. It has been running a status flag since your submission. I read the document. It said, candidate completion status, anomalous, battery submission prior to second closure siren, no historical comparison data available. Refer to Director of Trial Candidacy for manual review and classification determination. The director, Vethsel continued, has also reviewed the observation log you submitted to the trial design team. 47 entries. She looked at me. She has some questions. She would like to speak with you. Of course. She would also like to know. Vethsel paused, checking an internal document. Whether you would be willing to continue trial candidacy, not observer track, full candidacy, third-tier intake. I looked at her. She has cleared the preconditioning rotation requirement, Vethsel said. On the grounds that the architecture's own observation data from your 9-day trial constitutes a documented equivalent. Outside the window of the common room, the station moved through its slow rotation, and the light shifted across the table, in the direction light was supposed to go. The shadows falling exactly where the geometry said they should. Yes, I said. Be willing. Vethsel wrote something in her file. The fourth ocular ridge settled. I will inform the director, she said, gathered her documents and went. I picked up my log. The last entry was still the last entry. 9 days, 4 survivors. 112 observations. Battery submitted at 0612. Second siren at 0620. True and accurate record. I added one more line at the bottom, because it was where the record was going. Third-tier intake begins on approval. Preconditioning waived. The architecture, I noted, has not yet seen what a prepared candidate looks like. Neither had I. I was ready to find out.